Okay. We are live. Hi, everybody. This is a great group tonight. Great turnout. Hello, everybody out there inside the camera. So welcome to our weekly basic income discussion group. Unfortunately, the sound quality is a little worse today because I couldn't get the microphone to work. So we've got the built-in microphone on my laptop. And the stream quality may or may not be bad. So we might end up uploading a video of this afterwards if the stream doesn't go well. So yeah, we're here to talk about socialism versus capitalism. And these are interesting concepts. There's a lot of, I guess, political contentiousness between socialism and capitalism. And so I have a question, or I have a few questions. One is, how does basic income fit in? Is it more compatible with capitalism, or is it more of a socialist idea, or is it kind of orthogonal to the two? And then another question is, people who are pro-socialism tend to see kind of capitalism as bad, and people who are pro-capitalism tend to see socialism as bad. So how do these two camps define the other camp's point of view? So if you are a capitalism supporter, how would you define socialism? And if you're a socialism supporter, how would you define capitalism? So I kind of want to start with those questions and go around the room and get thoughts from everyone.
Cool. So I'm not an expert on like the two camps, but I guess the way I would think about it is in terms of what kinds of things are like centralized organizations the best at managing for society, and what kinds of things work best as emergent from individual people's choices. I don't know if those exactly map onto capitalism and socialism, but those are the concepts that are kind of useful for me. And for me, it's a question, like I said, of which things, as opposed to it's always good for, a state or something like that to manage everything, or it's always good to have no state. Neither of those positions are my positions, but so I think more in terms of what is good for what. Basic income as construed by you, which is the form of it that I know the best, is something that optimizes the capacity of the sort of individual choice-based market to align well with people's well-being by, for example, giving people money to spend so that the profit motive is aligned with their well-being in that way, and dealing with a problem that isn't dealt well with by the emergent properties of people's individual spending, which is how to flow money back to consumers. So money tends to flow up in that kind of way and doesn't necessarily naturally flow back to consumers very efficiently. And also, it seems like basic income might be well handled by a well-functioning government as one option. So in that sense, it kind of maybe aligns with the socialist side, but it might also align well with the capitalist side in the sense of allowing the free market, including the labor market, to operate very efficiently in a way that maybe it isn't doing now. So I guess that's how I see it. It's like helping each piece of things to work at what it's good at in the best way possible.
And what would a socialist say capitalism is?
Oh, well, so like I said, I almost don't want to use those terms because I don't really know what they mean, but I'll take a gander, I guess. A cartoon version is like, a socialist might complain that capitalism is a system that cares about the accumulation of money, maybe for a few people, maybe for no one, and doesn't care enough about well-being. And a capitalist might say socialism is a system that is naive about how to have an efficient economy that actually works well for the prosperity of everybody.
Okay. Pablo.
I think basic income is a capitalist version of the welfare scheme, because you notice that all the socialist governments, they have a lot of welfare schemes. They give you, some countries have free housing, some countries have free food, some of them have free education. I think basic income is, we're not going to pay you in those services and goods, we're going to just give you money. It's up to you how you use it. Because in India we also have a lot of welfare schemes, and there it gives a lot of opportunity for politicians to start, getting corruption in. And that hurts the economy. Instead, if you just say that instead of, like in India we used to have gas subsidies, we had electricity subsidies, we had subsidies in education and job quotas as an affirmative action for the lower marginal class subsidies classes. But that it has a lot of corruption in it, and it hasn't uplifted the backward classes as it was supposed to do. So I think just giving them the money and letting them figure out how to use it best, I think is a better option and leaves little room for corruption. I think that's capitalism answer to the need for welfare.
I like some aspects of capitalism and I like some aspects of socialism. Capitalism works to make a country wealthy, but it doesn't work for financial equality. So you'll be able to be helpful for capitalism for that.
Right. I think from a capitalist market point of view, basic income doesn't go hand in hand. I think capitalism, like if somebody's skills is more valued in the market, then they would be paid. So I think it's kind of a, like you said, a subsidy really. It's kind of altering the free market. So, I think from a capitalist point of view, I don't really know enough about socialism.
Okay. Zlako.
Well, as far as basic income goes, I agree with you that it's orthogonal, that I think basic income can work in both a socialist and a capitalist state. Personally, I try to be unbiased, but I generally support capitalism more than socialism because I support the free market, I support people having more freedoms and more control than the government. So, yeah.
Okay.
That's the short summary.
Yep. Elizabeth.
Basic income feels to me more like a socialist thing, although like having listened to you talk about it a lot, I have a better understanding of how it can integrate really well with capitalism. But I think I'm partly to Robert's point about I feel like the capitalist economy wants to not pay workers at all, if at all possible. Like it only pays them because it has to. Like and so basic income feels more like a socialist, like, oh, we're going to give things to people just because they deserve them for existing. How the social side would define capitalism, I think, like, capitalism is like the exploitation of the labor class, is trying to get as much labor out of workers for as little money as possible. So basic income feels sort of like the opposite of that.
Yeah. Richard.
Well, basic income is neither capitalistic or socialistic. It's it's implied in the article. It has properties of both, and it's orthogonal. As I've said at the same time, it's in capitalism and socialism, they both expect you to get jobs. While with basic income, if it's high enough, you don't even need to get a job if you don't want to. With socialism, basic income, you need to function well. You probably need socialized health care, which if you have to have, if it's not included with your basic in your economy, it would take a large chunk out of your basic income. So, or would be completely unaffordable. The way socialism is viewed in this country is, well, rather inaccurate. It's just a word thrown around for no particular reason. Like the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare is, well, not socialistic. It's rather capitalist based, and it's based on Mitt Romney's, or the former governor of Massachusetts,
the Massachusetts healthcare.
Yeah, Massachusetts healthcare reform.
Yeah. Okay, Dimash.
I could say that basic income, from my point of view, is capital. The community benefits, like community is first, and there is no such thing as individualism in socialism. No, how could I say it? When there is a socialism, people believe that government must do everything for them. Like there is free education, free medicine, and free houses, free car, etc. Like you don't really need to worry about tomorrow's day, or about salaries, about money, to be like always worrying about your existence, about your surviving, because everything is okay already. The government already provides you with all the goods that are necessary. That's like an ultimate socialism. But it's like how it was said, like it's pretty naive way of thinking about economy. And that is why it doesn't work well when like people try to apply it. But basic income is like another question. When it's capitalism, there's a big group of people who are hurt by it. Like they, due to their specific like characteristics, I guess, or their origin perhaps, they cannot benefit from it because they the labor they provide is not in demand, for example, or it's cheap according to the market and etc. For them, some income, like regardless of anything, just income for their existence is necessary because they could not survive only on their salaries due to the free market, which is like determined by the capitalistic society. But during the socialism, it's like you already have house, your children go to school, like you have education, you didn't pay for anything of it. Like why do you need like more income? But in capitalism, for example, if you're from some poor areas, like and it's really and there's like some situation that because of which you cannot get an education, or your salary is really like low, you need some help from government, which is basic income. But on the other hand, basic income, I think it must not be like universal thing, like for everyone. For example, in big cities, if you got education, if you have your job, like well-paid job, not like you're really rich, but it's well paid, you can afford like a good life, like good standards of life. Why do you need like basic income? So it will make you, as it was said again, it will make you lazy and less competitive in the capitalist society. Yeah, I think
Okay.
that.
So I think these are great comments from everyone, and I can kind of see everyone's perspective too. I really liked Pablo's comment that basic income is like subsidizing the free market. I think, definitionally, I think the simplest definitions of socialism and capitalism are that capitalism is private ownership of the means of production, and then socialism is collective ownership of the means of production. And when I hear these two definitions, I automatically think, well, it's more efficient for some things to for some resources to be allocated and some things to be provided by the free market, and it's more efficient for other resources to be allocated and services to be provided by the government collectively in the interest of the people. So I feel like there's always going to be both. And if you have like a philosophy of everything needs to be free market, or everything needs to be kind of collectively controlled, then what you're striving toward is never going to be the right answer. So I think one question we can ask is what kinds of things should be managed for the benefit of everyone, and what kinds of things should be left up to the markets. And I liked what Bethany said about, when people have money. But yeah, as far as basic income goes, I would say that it's both socialist and capitalist, in the sense that it funds the free market, so people can be free to make their own decisions with what they want, how they want to spend their money. But it's also something that's provided by the government. It's provided for the collective benefit of people. So there's kind of this hybrid here that you can't really have a properly functioning free market if there isn't some kind of collective management of it. And obviously, you can't have any kind of society if you don't have some kind of market that allocates resources efficiently. So my mom is on here, Joan Houlihan. So she says, basic income seems to fit the socialist perspective, having to do with equality and community well-being for all, and also fits the consumer-driven perspective of capitalism, keeping the profits going. We already have a mix. For example, social security, welfare, and education. Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I think we already have a mix. And I think it's impossible to have a 100% free market economy, and it's impossible to have a 100% socialist economy. You don't have an economy. Yeah. This is the first article. It's an article from Teen Vogue last year, and I got a little bit of criticism for choosing this article because of kind of how, I guess, simplistic it is in terms of representing the socialist perspective on capitalism. But it's also true that when this article first came out last year, a lot of my network and a lot of my friends were like, wow, I've never seen capitalism described so clearly and so well. I'm going to read more Teen Vogue now and stuff like that. So this is definitely something that resonates with people. Does anyone have any more thoughts?
Well, I was going to add that an interesting way in which it's a hybrid that you talk about a lot is that, and also kind of relates to Elizabeth's question in an interesting way, is that giving people a basic income allows the labor market to be a free market and still have a humane society in a certain sense. So if you're requiring people to get all of their income through the labor market, and actually several people mention this kind of thing, and then they might just not have a skill that's in demand. They might not have, we might not need their labor at all in an efficient economy. And so to tie your entire income to that, you either have to choose between a society that's not really working for the people very well, or at least not a lot of them, or you have to make the labor market not a free market, not a capitalist, really a capitalist market for labor. And so I think that's the position we're in now is kind of an imperfect hybrid of the two. We're sort of leaving people behind and also making the labor market certainly not just a free market to try to help people. And it sort of could be potentially a lot better to just include a basic income, and like you also often talk about, and let the labor market be more capitalistic with that sort of support.
Yeah, I think what Elizabeth was saying before, where one of the features of capitalism is that employers want to pay as little as possible for their labor. That's only a bad thing if people need to get their incomes from labor.
Right, exactly.
If people are expecting to, so that's exactly right.
And I think the way you think about emphasizing the consumer, so that's actually kind of good for the consumer, assuming the consumer has their money coming from somewhere, which isn't really the case right now. So obviously people aren't usually, if they don't have a job. So, but and I think capitalism in a way, or the free market, can be a tremendous engine for creating wealth, and an efficient labor market can be part of that. It's just not necessarily distributing that wealth in the way that we would want.
Yeah. If people have access to spending money, then the profit motive of the companies is aligned with doing things that are good for consumers, for all consumers.
Yeah. And also I was just pointing out that it doesn't necessarily naturally flow the money back to consumers.
Right, there's no mechanism in the economy that puts money into consumers' hands. And we've kind of jury-rigged the labor market to force money to people through wages and stuff like that. But then you have a more inefficient labor market. I quickly want to get back to how pro-capitalism people and pro-socialism people think about the other side. I think, people who are pro-capitalism and pro-socialism, by and large, everyone wants to live in a prosperous society where
Right.
people are doing as well as possible, and you don't want, poverty and all of that. I think and I think some people said this, I think, the pro-socialism people view the pro-capitalism people as promoting, like greed and self-interest and, leaving people behind, and, that leads to poverty. And then the pro-capitalism people, I think some people were mentioning as well, I think you mentioned this first, it feels naive to people who understand the power of the markets to create wealth to interfere with that, because then maybe everyone's going to be worse off.
Right.
Or
it could even feel kind of tragic, like there's this beautiful mechanism that creates prosperity so fantastically, and why would you get rid of it?
Right, and then you're sabotaging that, and people are worse off. Yeah.
Great.
Chris.
Good to see you.
So I think with that we can start getting to quotes from the article. Both of the articles I picked are somewhat anti-capitalistic, which is fine for me because I'm kind of pro-capitalistic. So I feel like that side will be represented. I think there are other people in here that feel that way too. So the first quote from the article is this one.
Can I just ask you, how did you find the article in Teen Vogue? Is that like a magazine?
This was a popular article among my network of friends, many of whom are socialists. Hello. What's your name?
Jared.
Nice to meet you. I'm Alex, and this is everyone else. So we're getting to the first quote from the Teen Vogue article. So this quote is, "The kind of impact that capitalism has on your life depends on whether you're a worker or a boss." So I thought that's very interesting because it's kind of dividing people into these two categories. You're either a worker or a boss. What about people who aren't workers or bosses, right?
Right.
And I think this is, Bethany brought this up, but what matters in terms of people's well-being is what they get out of the economy, not necessarily what they put into the economy. And by framing everyone as either a worker or a boss, you're kind of saying, you're defined by what you put in. You're either a laborer or you're someone who wrangles the laborers or something like that. And I think there's more to people than that, and I do like to think about people more as consumers. What can the economy produce for them rather than what are they putting into the economy?
But I find it's really interesting to hear other people's perspectives, because sometimes elements that I wouldn't focus on or wouldn't think of as defining one or the other are actually really strongly in people's minds.
Yeah.
Like this distinction, or like the concern about exploitation, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Anyone have any thoughts about that quote? I got a lot of them, so we don't have to worry about running out. You don't have to fill in or anything like that. Yeah.
I mean, when you say that you think it's a problem to divide people into a worker or a boss, are you positing that as a problem with the socialist framing of capitalism, or a problem with capitalism? I just want to understand.
I think people who identify themselves with capitalism and socialism, they all kind of have this labor orientation. Mm-hmm. With socialism, it's about the workers deserve stuff, and with capitalism, it's maybe about the workers need to do the work to earn the stuff or something like that. But it's still about the workers either way, a lot of times. And I'm saying that maybe that's when I posted the description of this meetup, I asked if there were things that capitalism and socialism agreed on and whether they were all right or they were all correct. And one of the things I was getting at was this kind of focus on labor that I think both sides are getting wrong. Yeah.
But they're not. I think people also, it's a good article because most people, when they hear capitalism, they confuse it with the definition of the invisible hands. I mean, capitalism has been around forever. I mean, once a man thinks about identifying a piece of property or a woman, right? And start trading it. It could be a piece of meat, or it could be a piece of rock. That's capitalism, or we're trading.
So how is that different from the invisible hand?
The invisible hands, taken to the extreme degree, says everything should be left to the invisible hands of the marketplace, and there should be no social intervention of any kind. Active intervention.
I would take issue with
Adam Smith does not say that.
Yeah.
No.
I would say that it's
So
just
Adam Smith Adam Smith absolutely does not say that. But people who took his words, because most people actually hadn't read his whole book. Most people who refer to the invisible hand had not read the entire book by Adam Smith. So Adam Smith actually says something quite opposite. But the people who use his book and use the invisible hands as a, how do you say it, a code word, right? Will say that is what the invisible hand means, which is basically saying that there should be no government intervention, which make capitalism go against socialism, which
So-
in fact that capitalism and socialism can live side by side pretty peacefully.
So let me see if I understand correctly what you're saying. Are you saying that capitalism is just markets, and then the invisible hand is the expectation that everything can be handled automatically by markets?
Right. So there's a group of people in society that will argue that everything will turn out well. Sometimes, but they agree there will be winners and losers, right? But the winners and losers are determined by the invisible hand. So, it's just tough luck if you're the losers. And that's the basic conclusion of that particular group.
Okay.
Right? But
All right.
that's not capitalism. That's not the definition of capitalism. But a lot of people think that is, both on the left and
What would
right.
you say is the definition of capitalism? We started talking about this before you got here, but
No, I actually define it. I'll say that without making it very complicated, is that
Yeah.
when first people between two hunter and gatherers start to trade with each other, and then, but not only do it once. It's not like I'm starving but I have some like shiny object.
Are you drawing any kind of distinction between capitalism and markets, or are you just saying capitalism is the market
Capitalism is
economy?
the first time people understand that your stuff is worth something and my stuff is worth something, and we both recognize that they have some sort of value, and we start trading it fairly consistently.
So is
Because then you understand there's that's the word capital. I mean, you have a piece of property that has a defined value. So it's not only valued by you, but that's kind of valued by lots of people. And I'll probably just say, just keep it there.
Okay.
Because it's really, because once you start adding additional definition and whatever to it, it becomes very polluted.
Okay. So I'm going to move on to another book. Okay, that wasn't what I thought was going to come up. But yes, capitalism is, so we're just asking you what you thought the definition of capitalism is, and Kim Kelly says, capitalism is defined as an economic system in which a country's trade, industry, and profits are controlled by private companies instead of by the people whose time and labor powers those companies. So I would say that it's still, it's still presenting this dichotomy between companies and then the people who are producing what's being produced. Now, the benefits of the economy should go to the people, right? I think everybody agrees with that, and that's, again, kind of what you get out of the economy. So I think I put these two quotes together because I think they're kind of making the same mistake, that there's a choice. Either profits go to private companies or they go to laborers, and there's a third option, which is to people.
Right. And
Yeah.
for example, someone without a job doesn't really have a place in this.
Someone without a job has no place in this model, right? And socialists might try to claim the person who doesn't have the job and say, well, this is a worker who's out of work, but they're really a worker at heart or something like that.
Why doesn't
Yeah.
the person, so the other question you'll say is, why doesn't the person have a job? Is it because of his or her choice, or because they didn't have a choice? If the person says, I enjoy playing Xbox pretty much all the time, and I really don't want to work, and I'm
Sure, so there could be a lot of reasons why someone doesn't have a job.
so
And
the reason
when-
becomes important.
I don't know that the reason becomes important. I know that for anyone who doesn't have a job, there's clearly it's not worth it for them to be working, given whatever their circumstances happen to be. Maybe I don't know. The reasons can be anything, right?
Your mom has a lot of stuff with her.
Yeah. So I think what matters is that from the production side of things, what matters is that the people who we need to be working are working. So that'll kind of be determined by the market. So if this guy's playing Xbox, but suddenly the economy needs him to be working, then the market can decide to pay him enough to get him to work.
But maybe he doesn't I don't want to drag it down, but maybe
Yeah.
he just doesn't feel like working no matter how much you pay him or her.
Well, then they'll find someone else, right? So
But then what do you do with that person?
what do you mean? You don't need to use them. You don't want your labor force to be full of people who
No,
don't
no,
wanna
no,
work.
no, no, but then, okay, keep going.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah,
Pablo.
I think like for some clarity, the Bureau of Labor Statistics defines unemployment as unemployed as someone who wants to work, is able to work, but is unable to get work.
Right.
There's clearly an element of motivation to it. You have to be motivated to work to be counted as
Right.
unemployed.
And if you're not working, but you're not like looking for a job, then you're just not counted in the labor force. And I think Chris is a little bit wondering, what about the people who aren't in the labor force? Is that okay? That kind of thing. Is that what you're asking about, Chris?
No, I think, see, you guys are talking about the benefit get distributed, you're sort of like the benefit gets distributed to the people, right?
Yeah.
So this is where, we had done this before, where the fairness question and the basic income comes in, and just because,
Well,
if society, so without taking production into account,
yeah.
within the current system, there's definitely a reward and punishment system going on. So the reward is that if you work, you get rewarded with subsistence and payment most times.
Well, you get
And
rewarded
then-
with payment.
All right, but if you
Yeah.
do not work, your punishment will be no payment
Sure.
normally, unless you have like some kind of annuity.
Yeah, so I mean, the question is, obviously in order for the economy to function, consumers need money. So the question is, how do you get money to those consumers? What's the most efficient way? And there's no law of economics that says an efficient labor market will provide consumers with enough money to maximally activate the productive capacity of the economy, or what the economy is capable of producing for them. So we kind of expect three different things from the labor market. We expect people to get their incomes from the labor market. We expect efficient allocation of labor, and then we also expect workers to get meaning and purpose, that kind of thing. Now the problem is if you are focusing on just efficient allocation of labor, then there's no guarantee that people's incomes will be optimal to buy stuff, and there's no guarantee that they'll have happy lives or that kind of thing. So the question is, if we want people to get their incomes from jobs, how much efficiency in the labor market do we want to sacrifice in order to boost incomes, in order to create jobs, that kind of thing, to get money to people? Because once you're doing that, you're kind of by definition, to some degree, making people do work that the economy doesn't really need them to do. So is it okay if someone really doesn't like to work and they're staying home playing Xbox? I think in an efficient labor market, if you don't need the people who really don't want to work, if you don't need them to work, then that's an okay thing, and it's actually more efficient.
There's an interesting question over there.
Yeah.
Employee stockholders.
Yeah, so my mom said there are plenty of companies with employee stockholders. Are those companies socialist? So that's an interesting question, and you can ask the same thing about companies that really, provide benefits to their employees above and beyond what they would need to do to get them to work. So I think you could characterize those companies as socialist to some extent, and to some extent in our society, a lot of us want corporations to be socially responsible and to take care of their workers and that kind of thing. And that raises the question, should it really be the responsibility of private companies to kind of go above and beyond and do that? Or should it be more the responsibility of the government, who's really designed to represent the collective interest of the people in the first place? So I would say that by expecting companies to do this, to kind of take care of the workers instead of the government taking care of the people, the government is somewhat foisting its responsibilities onto the private sector. Yeah, go ahead, Richard.
Well, in the U.S., the government expects the companies to, most of the time, to provide their health insurance,
Yeah.
which makes it difficult to search for another job because the benefits are not transferable, and there's there's bills around. They're being floated around to make that you pay into a fund, and so that the benefits are transferable. unemployment insurance and the healthcare and whatnot.
Yeah, yeah, and I think there's a lot of stuff like that whereby by pushing this stuff to people through employers, well, one, you're forcing them to work, and another, it makes it really hard to be mobile within the labor market. Yeah.
So can I bring back, you mentioned two sort of things, companies that were partially worker owned, like an employee stock ownership plan or something,
Yeah.
and then companies that you said took social responsibility on themselves to provide for their workers.
Yeah, there could be some overlap
In-
there.
Well, so in my head, those are completely unrelated things. Socialism, like from a classical Marxist perspective, socialism is workers owning the means of production. It would be owning the company, not only part of it, but the entire thing. That would be a socialist company. And a company that provides for its workers is still capitalist. It might be friendly capitalists, but are ultimately capitalist. Capitalism, at least from like a classical Marxist perspective, is about who has power. And the people with power would be the people who own the company, regardless of what they choose to do with that power.
I think that's right. So you're saying that a company that's just providing employees with benefits above and beyond, they still have all the power. So they might be using that power benevolently, but it's not as socialistic as an employee-owned company would be.
Right. Well, like from a classical Marxist
Or not at
perspective,
all.
it's simply not
Not at all.
socialist. Yes.
Yeah. Probably. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there are some interesting companies. For example, recently in the news, like there was a article about Google where the workers strike against, launching a search engine which was keeping in mind the firewall system of China. So they said they protested against it and eventually influenced the decision by the board, when the board that delayed or postponed the launch of a search engine in China. And if you search for this company called Semco, it was in Brazil, I guess it operated in the 90s, and they had a very democratic system. So the entrepreneur, the founder of the company, Ricardo Semler, he proposed a system where the decisions will be taken democratically. The shares will still be owned by the company, but then the workers were voting for a decision, for a strategy. So that again, like they have the power. At the end, they have the power, but then the profits are not going to them. They still have some employee stock options, but then again, the decision was collectively taken by the, right from C-suits to the blue collars.
So they can actually even vote for the CEO's job in Santos. He actually got voted out. He was actually, I went to one of his speeches. It's kind of funny because eventually they said, oh yeah, this year we would like to fire you instead. Yeah, that's our conclusion for this year. It's like, okay, you guys want, that's you feel like it, I'm out. But I think it's a subtle distinction. So if the U.S. government tell Google and Microsoft that you must provide this levels of pay and insurance measured by hard metrics, I would say that's more closer to socialism because the government enforced policy that makes the company to provide a certain type of services.
Sure.
If the company just provide the service themselves, like you said, benevolent type, they do have the option to withdraw that at any time based on economic conditions.
So yeah,
that's not socialism.
so I agree with you that if the government says companies have to do that, that might be a little bit more socialistic because the government is representing the people collectively. But it doesn't mean the company is more socialistic. They're just following whatever.
No. It's just society. I don't know. You can.
The culture.
Yeah, I mean the society will
Right.
have a more socialistic culture, kind of like the Nordic model. That is the Nordic model actually, because the companies still are based on a capitalistic structure,
Right.
but the country through taxes and legislation have a pretty heavy hand on enforcing social policies.
Well, I think that's kind of the distinction I'm getting at. That like, in modern usage, I see the word socialism used to mean something very similar to the Nordic model, where we have some sort of very robust welfare system, or something like UBI, Universal Basic Income, where we're providing security for people. That's not what the term socialism has conventionally meant up until fairly recently. That's not what Marx or Rosa Luxemburg or Engels or Lenin or any of those people would have meant by the term.
Well, see, the thing is,
So-
it gets sort of confusing to go split between Marxism,
Hold on, Chris.
socialism, and communism.
I'm gonna interrupt you because we can go down that rabbit hole forever.
I don't want to.
Hi, what's your name again?
Jared.
Jared. So at the beginning, I asked people whether they thought basic income was more aligned with socialism or more aligned with capitalism, and I want to hear your thoughts on that.
That's an interesting question. That's actually one of the reasons I came, because I saw that on the
Yeah.
solicitation, and I
Yeah.
thought, I don't have an answer to that. I'm interested in hearing other people's thoughts.
Okay.
I think it probably, in a soft sense, gives more power to the worker, insofar as people with cash to spend have more freedom over their daily lives and can therefore take more political action. But I don't consider it to have a strong bearing either way.
Okay. Cool. And hi.
As a practical socialist,
Yeah.
did you live in the Soviet Union? You just know the
I'm too
theory.
young.
It looks like you know more theory than I do, even though I lived there and studied it.
Oh,
Huh?
oh, I said oh.
So this basic income is neither. It is related to humanism, if you want, but it's neither capitalism nor socialism. And in a certain sense, it makes capitalism a little bit more palatable to the person. And it makes socialism even less effective. By the way, you saw that just recently, like within the last 2-3 days, they started publishing papers about the results of the Finnish experiment.
Yes.
You know, not a breakthrough, like they said, you know. But an important part of this, which if you look at those things only from the theoretical economic point of view, you can design various models and everything, but it completely leaves out the human relationships. In the Soviet Union, for instance, the nationalism played a major role, regardless, because there was a hierarchy of ethnic groups, if you want. And no matter what your capabilities, what your merits are, you may not get anything. The principles of socialism, as we were taught, but not always did observe, was that number one, the means of production are in the hands, they said, of the people, but of course, in reality, it was in the hands of the government. You can own, well, if you own 50% of the stock of the company, of course, you have some power, you have some control. But if you own like 0.5%, it's nothing. It doesn't make you, it doesn't provide any power, it doesn't make the company socialist, because the decision making is still in the hands of somebody else. Now, in the Soviet Union, eventually they theoretically moved to that model. They said that workers now have some power of workers, but it didn't lead to, it led to nowhere. So one principle was, as I said, like the means of production. Who owns the means of production? The other principle is, I don't know how to translate it in English correctly, but if literally to translate from Russian, like every labor, I should say every piece of labor, should be paid for. And there was a famous caricature, like they show, like in the first picture, like there is a flat ground, and a worker with a shovel comes and digs a hole and leaves. And the second picture, another worker comes and puts all that soil back into the hole. So the surface was as flat as it was. Both of them must be paid, because they, so the usefulness of the results was never considered. So,
well, it's useful because it provided labor, right? I mean, during the Depression.
Oh, yes.
But during the Depression, same thing happened here. That's a New Deal. That's actually 50% of the New Deal, which is basically Roosevelt will say, people have no job, they're not getting paid for, starving. So I'm going to borrow against, the Treasury, and I'm going to send these people out and literally make them dig a ditch, right? And send another crew and fill the ditch up, and both teams got paid.
So
the important thing here is not economic value in the short term. The important thing is that their family got fed.
But from a certain perspective, how disrespectful of human time and energy to make somebody dig a hole and pull it back in, to give them.
But those people are
money, right?
starving.
To be
Yeah,
fair,
they were
I mean, I mean, like,
Wait,
but-
how, let me say it again. How disrespectful, from a certain perspective, I don't think that's where people are coming from, but from a certain perspective, how
Yeah.
disrespectful of the time and energy of a human being to make someone do something worthless as an excuse to pay them, right? As opposed to just giving them the money.
Right.
For the record, I'm unaware of there ever actually being an instance of Roosevelt doing exactly that.
Right.
I know people were put to work, like in the National Park Service and other
Right.
places, doing jobs which otherwise probably we wouldn't have bothered to put money into
But
doing.
it actually, yeah, you actually needed a little more.
They were building roads, as far as I understand. That was the main.
Right.
It's not that they were just digging holes
Right,
just for
right.
nothing.
But-
Right.
But
Yeah.
you know what? Again, in the Soviet Union, it's a saying among the people. It wasn't a socialist, Marxist principle. They say, they pretend they are paying us, and we pretend we are working. And it happened all the time. Like I worked at a research institute. There were some people who were interested in doing some research, some development, blah, blah. Lots of, I'm sorry, don't want to sound sexist, but lots of women, ladies, they would come, they would pick up their knitting, and they would start knitting. They were doing that the whole day. Okay? So, if it is the socialist system as it was implemented in the Soviet Union, it was extremely inefficient because nobody had real interest except of a couple of people. And even with that low productivity, a small group, in other words, the Communist Party and its functionaries, even with that low productivity, the whole country, which is huge and has lots of natural resources, produced so much that that small group of people lived pretty good lives. Everybody else was on the brink of whatever. Although these days, when they say it's capitalism in Russia, people live much worse. Many. Not everybody, but many people live in much worse.
So I want to get back to what we were talking about, the 1930s and the New Deal. So I think, if there was any literal digging holes and filling them back in again, I think that would have been a very small, negligible part of what was being done. But it's also true that anytime you're creating jobs for the purpose of paying people, rather than for the purpose of for the ultimate product, for how useful the work is. Anytime you're doing it for the purpose of giving people money, there's some amount of kind of inefficiency there and waste.
That's a job guarantee, pretty much.
Right. So you hear about, we have like people talking about the Green New Deal now, which is kind of funny because they want to work on fighting climate change and doing good things for the environment, but at the same time they're creating jobs as a way of getting people incomes, which is wasteful of resources. If you want to have green infrastructure and green technology, you want to put that stuff in place using as little resources as possible, and that includes using as little labor as possible. And labor has externalities too. When people commute, that causes emissions, and we would want to
Yeah, so one of
Yeah.
the things that I think you're really good at is like separating different goals that we have really clearly so
Right.
that we can meet each one as effectively as possible. And
Right.
so here I might say like we would have the goal to invest in green energy, or we would have the goal to invest in parks, right? But we also have the goal of getting money to people.
Right.
But by separating them, you would argue you can do each one of them better. So you
Do
can
each one more efficiently,
efficiently
yeah.
invest in the parks, and you can efficiently give people money. And some of that will involve hiring them to work in the parks, but that will be only as is efficient.
Right.
And I think politically people might have a reason to lump them together, but in theory,
Right.
it makes sense to separate
There would,
them.
if you're spending on infrastructure, that kind of thing, that will naturally create jobs. How many jobs? Well, we'll find out based on how much work you need done, instead of, I want to create X number of jobs, let's find some work for them to do. Does that make sense? Yeah.
If I may, like a
Yeah.
quick example, from my own experience, when I came to this
Yeah.
country in a couple of years, which
Yeah.
was 25 years ago, something like that,
Okay.
and I was invited as a consultant to Boston Scientific. And I was talking with their quality manager, like medium level manager, not a vice president, but not a, how they call it. Anyway, and I said to him, like, if you do that and that and that, you would be able to produce your product with smaller number of workers. And I was stunned by his reaction because I really didn't mean anything bad to the workers, but I was stunned when he said, no, we have no layoffs, no way that we are laying people off. I didn't mean that. I meant that, okay, you can start another product,
Right.
you can do something else. But that was his immediate reaction when I said that you can use fewer workers than.
And I find this so fascinating because I think it's not at all conscious, but like again, implicit, there's kind of a disrespect for people's time in a way. But I think only because we have to give people income through the labor market now. But like the idea is like we don't want to make our use of people's time more efficient in the labor market, right?
To what you were saying about separating concerns,
Right.
like it sounds like the two concerns we're trying to separate here are almost there are people with time on their hands, and we should find productive things for them to go do.
Right.
And
right.
completely unrelated to that, also people should have like food to eat and places to live and things.
Yeah, exactly. And it might not make sense to like lump those together, especially if you care about individual choice, right? So like, I would even wonder like how much, once we give people money, I would wait and see how much people need additional help to find purpose and meaning and that kind of thing. And maybe they do, but maybe it doesn't come through a job or something
Well,
like that.
I mean, let's not get entirely utopian. There are things society needs done, right?
course.
Like,
Yeah.
if streets have to be swept, I'm not waiting to find the person who's
All I
gung ho
meant
to
is, like, sorry, I
sweep
didn't
streets.
specify, and we're paying for whatever we want to pay for in terms of people's labor. And then there's this question of like, if the labor market's working efficiently, and people still seem to have like a lot of extra time on their hands, and it's making them unhappy. Like I would wait and see if that happens, and then probably I wouldn't use the labor market to solve that problem.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
And I would say that it's less that there's people who are available to do labor and we should find something for them to do, and it's more that, consumers want to buy certain things, and that's naturally going to activate a certain amount of labor. And if consumers are buying everything they need, or we've reached some resource limit in the economy such that we're using up all of this one thing, but we still have extra labor, like that might be an okay thing.
And you didn't maybe explicitly put in there like state-funded useful things like street sweeping and stuff.
Right.
Yeah.
So the state is paying for all the infrastructure and everything that it needs, and then the market is responding to all the consumer demand that's there, assuming we have the maximum possible basic income for people, and the economy is maxed out. It's still possible that there's people who aren't working, and maybe those people are sad or something. So we'd figure out then how to spend resources on making their lives more interesting and fun and that kind of thing. That could be related to academics or sports, or like maybe there are some people out there where literally you have to make up useless work for them to do and force them to do it, and that's what makes them happy. But I don't think that's a lot of people.
Alex,
Yeah.
different question.
Yeah.
Back to your topic of the.
Yeah.
Question number one: do we think the United States right now is a capitalist country or a socialist country?
It is like, what would you even be measuring? But I think, as Jared was saying, it's about who controls the means of production. So there are certain things that are being produced in the private economies that's being incentivized by the private markets, and there are certain things that are being produced and provided for.
Different question.
Yeah.
Do you think countries should be more capitalistic or more socialistic as of now?
Well, I think it's hard to say what I think the balance should be, but I do think we need more of both. We need to give people basic income to stimulate the markets and have more private production, but we also need the government to be paying for more infrastructure. And
You want more capitalism and socialism at the same time.
Yeah.
well, I want more. Yeah.
By the definition of these things.
Right.
No,
So
but
I want more.
It makes sense
yeah.
because, well, first of all, so it makes sense when you break it down into the details, right? So, for example, under Alex's view, if you give people a basic income, the labor market can actually be more capitalistic because people aren't relying on it for their income. So, if some people aren't paid anything, or some people are paid $3 an hour, that's fine.
Right.
So that's in a way that it would be more capitalistic. But at the same time, you could want the government to spend more on infrastructure, or the government could.
Christian, what Christian was saying that it's a zero-sum game, that they're both lying on the same spectrum. Like if you go,
By these definitions. Yeah.
if you go more towards free market, then you're losing out on So I think that's what you meant. That you can't have more of both. You either have more of capitalism and less
Right.
capitalism, or
So
So can I By a conventional Marxist definition, that's not what capitalism is, but I kind of want to address that definition as is, because I don't want to start injecting random things into this. But by that standard, historically, the largest group of socialist and communist parties in the world have always been anarcho-communists, have always been people who considered themselves both anarchists and communists, and people who wanted a completely free market, didn't want there to be a government. So if what we mean by capitalism is a free market, and if what we mean by socialism is worker control of the means of production, not only can you have people who want both, I think historically those people are the majority of people who have ever called themselves socialists.
Wait, you're saying all the, I'm sorry, I didn't want to go down. You're saying all the communists are anarchists, historically?
Large numbers. People
No,
like the
no,
CNT
I mean,
in Spain
I
or
would
the Paris
Without going
Revolution.
through it, I would just surmise. You need to read more history. I'll just leave it at that, because we'll debate this thing.
Hold on, you guys.
This is an offline
So-
thing.
so-
Like, you can't
so
say
there's-
that. That's like
there's the philosophy of communism and socialism,
Right.
and then there's the politics, and how things have emerged. When you try to apply some of these philosophies, that maybe a pure communist.
no. I'll just say having grown up in China
It-
and then
Chris.
having gone through no.
Chris, I'm moderating this.
Yeah.
We'll get to you in a second. So there are some people who would say that when the philosophy of communism has been attempted to be applied in certain regimes, then it ends up being not pure communism, because there's too much government control, too much authoritarianism, that kind of thing. So there's kind of like little c communism and big C communism. You hear that kind of distinction sometimes. So looking at history, if a communist who's philosophically a communist might say, well, communism has never existed in the world, even though there are parties that call themselves communists and countries that call themselves communist countries. Is that accurate, Jared?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So go ahead with China.
No, I take exception to the word anarchist. I mean, if you really truly don't understand the meaning of anarchist, I mean, that's most of the Asian countries and by the culture, they're not looking to elect garments and leaders that are anarchists. That's not the culture and the history it's based on. So no matter what kind of government they have, they're always looking for control, top-down controls and stability. Okay, so you can look at Vietnam, you can look at
I absolutely agree with you with
So
respect to
the
China.
the
and
work,
Vietnam.
no, any of the Asian communist countries, you can just take them.
And Europeans as well.
Yeah, so anarchist is, yeah, I mean, that's the biggest thing I have. You cannot, those two things, the communism is about control. It's actually about absolute, the
So-
government is also about absolute control.
It's
So
about
anarchist
worker
is the
control, which is
separate-
not the same as government control.
No.
You
In the
just
Soviet
do more
Union,
application.
at least. And this, look, Karl Marx, as you know, planned to write the second volume of Das Kapital. He never completed it. In the first volume, he presented a more or less developed model, very abstract, theoretical model of the capitalism that existed at that time. John Kenneth Galbraith, in this new industrial state, developed that, and he showed how it was. But Marx never was able to write anything about the political economy of socialism. He just didn't know what to say,
Yeah.
even though he wasn't a fool by any means. He just didn't know.
For he didn't work even one day in his lifetime.
I'm not sure what bearing that has on this.
Now, I don't know, maybe I'm sorry because I was late, so maybe I missed it, but so far I didn't hear one thing about socialism that was never mentioned: centralized planning.
Yeah.
Centralized planning and very rigid planning. And at the same time, in the Soviet Union, the practice was, they realized that, so there was a huge building in downtown Moscow, which is named Gosplan, State Planning Committee. It was at the level of a ministry, and when they didn't have computers, they used all those, how to call it, Chinese abacus. You know, now these days they do have computers. So they tried to plan everything up to production of buttons for your shirts, and at the same time they realized that they cannot 100% precisely do that. So they encouraged people like at particular factories and plants, to go beyond that plan. And as a result, what happened? There is one factory making bolts, and there is another factory making nuts. And they both were given plans so that the number of bolts and nuts match each other. But because they were encouraged, economically encouraged, they would get some, how do you call it? Extra
Subsidy.
payment.
Subsidy?
Bonuses. No, they were bonuses for making more. So one factory would be a little bit more productive, so they would make lots of bolts. And for those bolts, there were no nuts. So it was completely wasteful production. And one thing that I heard myself from an economist in Moscow, I was sent, like, for some training. And the guy was, at that time, it was even before Gorbachev, before the perestroika. But he sounded very kind of liberal and revealing. And he said that the factory built by Fiat to make cars in the Soviet Union, those Fiat, after Vaz it's called. He said that huge plant was a tumor on the body of the Soviet industry. Why? Because it was designed by Italian engineers, and they assumed that each part is produced at the time when it is needed, not earlier, not later. And everything was like that. Everything should be coming in time, in the quantity that is required, not makes absolutely no sense, make more pistons when there are no cylinders, whatever. As a result, the whole industry of the Soviet Union was supposed to work for that particular plant because other factories work differently. And sometimes they had more cylinders, sometimes they had more pistons. And it ruined the whole thing. So that plant, even though it was built apparently more efficient, it was very harmful for the industry as a whole, of the centralized play. The Baltic republics, among other ethnic issues and everything, one thing that bugged them terribly, they were known in the Soviet Union for making good candies, pastries, all that stuff, right? If they developed a new recipe for a pastry, they had to get an approval in Moscow. So you can imagine how long it took. So it completely ruined the production of commodities and the consumption stuff. The metallurgy, where I worked, it was a different story. Metallurgy is a different story. Like ordinary people don't give a damn about steel or iron. But the government, which is concerned about making tanks and what else, cannons, they cared about steel. And as a result, the minister of our industry ordered each and every capacity, each and every furnace, because they use very old-fashioned furnaces. They built under Stalin. They built huge plants. At that time, it was a huge step ahead. But by that time, in the West, everybody went to converters. The converters are much, much smaller, but they allow to control the process and to produce steel of much, much higher quality and to very flexible. You can switch. If you need, you are making now those folding knives, you need one kind of steel. You are making cannons, you need another kind of steel. They could very quickly change it. With those huge furnaces in the Soviet Union, you cannot do that. Now, and the minister ordered that each furnace should work for production only. And the institute I worked for, we had absolutely no capacities to test our research project. Like somebody invented something, and we need just one furnace to try how it will work, because one thing is working in the lab, and a totally different thing working. Couldn't, because the minister doesn't allow. So this is one of the things with socialism.
Yeah, and especially central planning, it's really hard to know what's the efficient stuff to produce if you don't have a market.
And even
determining
more.
prices. Yeah.
For instance, this year, maxi skirts are in fashion. So the factory making fabric was planned to produce a certain number of square meters of that fabric. Suddenly, somebody came from France or from where, wearing a miniskirt. And everybody liked miniskirts. But the factory is planned to produce the same amount, and they keep working and working and working.
Yeah. Richard, go ahead.
Here's another example of they produced a bunch of milk in Kamchatka, which is by Alaska, and they had to ship it all the way over to around Moscow, and by the time it reached Moscow, it was spoiled. So they
No, I'm
produced.
sorry, nobody makes any milk in Kamchatka.
Oh, that's what
There's
they
no cows over there.
And so it spoiled.
It's a milk bowl.
So it spoiled, and they had to produce really bad cheese.
No, listen, they are not complete idiots. The milk for Moscow was produced around Moscow.
All right.
But one thing is that the question, do you want more capitalism or socialism?
Yeah.
Galbraith explained that under contemporary capitalism, or at least capitalism contemporary at that time, it was in the 60s he published his book, something like that. That if you look at any large American or any developed Western company, they have lots of planning. So planning under capitalism, using a mathematical terms, becomes piecewise. Each company does have lots of planning, but there is no centralized planning for the whole country, for the whole industry and everything.
They're planning based on information and what they believe will generate the most profit
Yes,
for
of
them
course.
too.
Yes.
If you try to centrally plan everything, then you lose all the market information. So let's move on to another quote from the article. So this is, I don't know how many people read the article, but this says, a capitalist nation is dominated by the free market, which is an economic system in which both prices and production are dictated by corporations and private companies in competition
That's a very
with
strange
one
way to
another,
put it.
and places a heavy focus on private property, economic growth, freedom of choice, and limited government intervention. What were you going to say about that?
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. It just really struck me that they said dictated by corporations and private companies
Right.
in competition with one another, which is particularly strange because you might have prices dictated by a monopoly company, but
Okay.
if companies have good competition, like the price would be set by other factors, like
Wouldn't it be
demand.
set by the
No,
market?
but
Yeah, exactly. So I thought that was a strange way of putting
Anyway,
it.
and if
Yeah.
the free market is really a misnomer because there's very few actually truly free markets.
Well, like we said, there's no fully free market economy, and there's no fully centrally planned economy, and it's always going to be like,
Right,
well,
so
where are you going to
that's
be?
the two issues, the thinking
So-
about company and the free market.
So the question is, and I kind of want to ask people, especially people who haven't had a chance to speak very much yet, what kinds of things do we feel should be centrally planned and centrally managed, and what kinds of things do we feel should be left up to the markets? Robert.
I guess just my general thought is the government should produce things that it can produce more efficiently and effective than the private market, so like national defense, I think that's a good example, like highways. I guess it gets into gray areas, and that's why we have politics of what should and shouldn't be privatized, but generally speaking, I think the rule of thumb is what can the government produce more efficiently than
Public goods categorizes.
He mentioned national defense and highways, but I think in some cases private markets work more efficiently than government.
For those two things.
Yes, for those two things.
See, the problem is
So
that the
let's-
efficiency, the definition becomes important.
So let's, I'll throw out an example. So let's talk about utilities. Let's talk about, the water supply to a town. Do you want, like you probably don't want two sets of pipes going to each neighborhood, right? That's pretty inefficient. And, those kinds of things are what we call natural monopolies, in the sense that it's just more efficient, more effective to have it be done by.
Right. Although one could ask whether you should have companies bid.
You
and,
could.
there
So-
could be various.
So there
hybrids.
can be a market aspect to it, like who gets to be the one who manages this infrastructure. Pablo.
Yes, one interesting thing, so in India, so a lot of times the government, throws the, auction open companies, like who's gonna bid, who gives a better offer.
Right.
What happens is that if you build a highway too good, you're not gonna work on that again for another maybe 5 or 6 years. For them, it's the incentive that hey, they get contracts repeatedly. So what they do is like sometimes they make like bad highways so that they need to reconstruct it again and again so they get more offers.
But
Right.
that could be fixed with a better incentive structure where like you didn't rehire a company if the road died too quickly.
Well, you can also, you're more likely to win the auction with a lower price, and you're more likely to be able to
Yeah.
offer a lower price if you
Well,
have a lower
yeah.
quality.
But
Yeah.
I guess not to discount this example is important, but I see it more as a problem of the implementation of how the bidding is done than the basic idea. I don't know if you agree or disagree.
Sort of, yeah.
Like in terms of what, like for example, maybe you should track
I
duration.
think a
and not-
better
not-
contract, like if you give
Yeah.
the responsibilities of maintaining that highway for a set period of years, maybe then companies will structure the thing in a better
Exactly,
way.
that's a good.
Elizabeth.
Yeah, I was just gonna say it's sort of relevant to the highway thing that that there's this problem of planned obsolescence being built into capitalism of that it's often hard to figure out ways to be okay, do we maybe pay that people who built the really good highway to maintain it? What kind of maintenance do you actually need, and is that aligned with the kinds of things
Yeah.
that they're actually well suited to do? And so that can be really hard, and so you end up with just oh, well, if we just have to make a new highway every 5 years, then there's still highway companies in business, and so that can be.
Yeah, you really have to get the incentives right because they're dictating what happens, right? I totally agree.
So I can give you like a real
Rick, we're gonna go
example.
Rick.
With fiber optic cables, they have different companies, but they all use the same cable, and so that's how it could be both at the same time.
Yeah. What's your name again?
George.
George,
Oh,
that's right.
George, sorry.
In my humble opinion,
Yeah.
the government should be concerned about sustainability of society. And this includes defense, healthcare, in a certain sense, even UBI. Although at this time it's more like in the natural form, not necessarily giving people money, but rather making sure that people can buy food. And when we say that capitalism makes companies more efficient, yes, it's more efficient if you look at the company as an entity. But then the question is that efficiency, how is it gets distributed? Who gets the benefits? If it all goes to a single owner, what's the point of that efficiency? So
Yeah.
the government should be concerned about that, not by dictating maybe the owner what to produce, but by taxing high incomes. And then redistributing it, not to make everybody rich, this is impossible, but make the society running. Because if there is no health insurance and I lose my job and I have young children, and God knows when I'll find another job, and even when I find it, that health insurance kicks in only in a few months,
Yeah.
it ruins the whole thing.
Well, I certainly agree with you that the responsibility of the government should be to ensure the prosperity of the people and provide the infrastructure and resources that people need.
Not
And that
prosperity,
includes,
but just the minimal basic level, like UBI.
well, ensuring that everything works to the benefit of the people. To the extent that the collective interests of the people need to be represented in the society and in the economy, that's the government's role. So that includes, making sure the markets work as effectively as possible, and something like a basic income can help with that. Yeah, go ahead, Pablo.
Yeah, I think on the topic of efficiency, when we talk about automation, so there's also a discussion like who will benefit eventually from these user innovations. Like, would the savings be transferred on to the consumers, or would the corporates just use it to raise it at profits? I think Andrew Yang had a pretty good answer to that. He said that they should tax every company using automation, and that tax revenue could go on to contribute to the UBI.
Yeah, so this is one of my gripes with Andrew Yang. For people who aren't familiar, Andrew Yang is a presidential candidate who's running as a Democrat in 2020 on a basic income platform. So fundamentally, what makes consumer spending possible is that the economy has the capacity to produce in response to that spending. So what makes basic income possible is that people have something to buy with the money. So by taxing production with a VAT tax, what you're doing is you are disincentivizing the production of goods. So you're actually reducing the amount of basic income you can afford. Does that make sense?
Maybe
So if you just
If you have a VAT of 20%, you have a basic income of $10,000, it's automatically reduced to $8,000.
well, I don't know if those numbers and what the numbers are in particular, but if your economy has a certain amount of productive capacity and there's unused productive capacity that could be activated by additional consumer spending, you can pay a basic income to people to activate consumer spending, so they can buy the stuff and activate that productive capacity. But if you start taxing production, now you're disincentivizing production. Production becomes less profitable, and people might make more financial investments instead, or try to find something else that's more profitable than actually producing stuff for consumers. So now the amount of room there is for additional consumer spending has decreased. So Andrew Yang is proposing a basic income of $1,000 a month, and it's unclear. I doubt that the VAT will prevent a $1,000 a month basic income. But if you're just asking what's the maximum possible basic income we can afford, the VAT is going to reduce that amount.
Another question, like if companies are adopting automation at a really fast pace and they're pushing down the cost by a lot. So should that affect the amount of basic income? Like you're pushing down prices of cars, a lot of things by like various factors.
Right. So in general, the average price level in the economy is not going to decrease. So it's not the case that the price of everything is going to come down, and the reason for that is because monetary policy is going to prevent it.
Yeah.
So we will have monetary expansion to prevent prices from decreasing. But really, what's happening is that the technology is making us capable of producing more with the same amount of resources.
Yeah.
So if you have technological advancement, instead of prices going down and that allowing people to buy more, what you can do is you can increase the amount of the basic income, and that's what allows them to buy more. So the things still cost the same amount, but now you have more money and you can buy more stuff.
Yeah.
That's what the technology does.
Shouldn't the government be able to provide less services with basic income? So this is this idea, right?
Yeah.
So the road and the defense, these things are so big, and it's got like a size advantage, right? So that cannot really be solved by something like the personal spending. But any kind of insurance that you have, you can, the insurance become privatized. All kind of like government subsidy can become privatized. Or not privatized, it could just be gone. I mean, you can purchase them on the marketplace because everything, I'll just give you enough UBI, and then you can make your own choices.
Yeah.
Now, if you choose to go buy hamburgers and versus like house insurance, you can do that.
Yeah. So I mean, it depends on what's going to be optimal for people. So I think with certain things like health insurance, where it's just a catastrophic thing that comes up every once in a while. It usually makes sense based on people's behavior that they're not going to plan for those catastrophic things that might not even happen to them. It could be a very low chance of it happening to any one given person. So things like insurance for that kind of stuff, it actually probably does make sense to provide centrally.
But why couldn't you have a
I
marketplace?
I was just going to say, like, a plug for economists, and I don't know these models super well, but academics, I think, economists have done a pretty good job kind of working out when you want something to be more centralized, and when you want it to be in the free market, in at least some cases, and health insurance tends to be one of the cases that even economists, academic economists, would say should be centralized, partly because of this catastrophic thing, so it's not actually necessarily like individually optimal, or I don't know if it's optimal or practical, I think optimal for individuals to save the appropriate amount because it might not happen to them, but then you still want the insurance to be there, so it kind of makes sense to centralize.
But do they make that conclusion? But they make that conclusion in a world without UBI.
I don't think UBI changes the equation, and I'll tell you why. I think they're answering the question like assuming people even have the money to pay. What is it optimal to allow individuals to decide themselves on, and what is it optimal to have handled in a centralized way? Which I think is the right question.
The economic argument is risk management more than it is like.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
And then there's flood insurance, which incentivizes people to build in risky places, like right next to the shore.
That's tricky. Yeah.
Yeah, so I would say that something like flood insurance, it might not make sense for the government to provide that directly because of what you just said, Richard. But certainly, if there's businesses out there and they think they can make money selling flood insurance to people, then they're welcome to do that. You run into the risk of they actually are not able to handle a disaster, like we saw with the California wildfires recently, and I guess Pacific Gas and Electric wasn't able to. There's something where they didn't anticipate the amount of damage, and they had to file for bankruptcy or something.
Yeah, they're not doing it out of the goodness of their heart. I mean, they're doing it because they want. If I'm the governor of a state of Florida or New Orleans, and I need to increase my, population growth, and economic short term, I offer flood insurance and indemnities, because without it, nobody will come build a house. With it, they'll come and build it, and then while I'm in office, I'll get the squirrels. It's not.
Yeah, I mean, there's
it's not an economic. It's not an economic optimization solution. It's more of a political solution.
Yeah, I mean, there's various incentives throughout the system that can kind of mess things up in one direction or another. But yeah, it can be tricky to figure out what the government should provide and what they shouldn't provide. And I think, like Robert was saying, some things are obvious and some things just aren't. That we kind of have to figure out. I think one thing that excites me about basic income is that once you have kind of the maximum possible basic income in place, you then can look at your society and look at your economy and say, okay, what do we still need? And then you might have a clearer view of what kinds of things should still be provided by the government, or maybe you have a clearer view of what kinds of things can be eliminated. Like if you have, minimum wage or various kind of social safety net programs and stuff like that to provide people money. After the basic income is in place, you might realize, well, nobody's really using these things or needs to use these things anymore. Yeah, go ahead, Pablo.
The social cost and benefit framework can be used to identify which goods and services are better managed by the central planning or market planning. So I'm just asking, would it be a feasible option to use a social cost and benefit model?
What is that kind of called?
So it's like economics, social cost and social benefit. If certain good is matching the social cost and benefit, so you say you go ahead, if reducing a certain good is has more social cost than benefit, then you say it's an inefficient reduction model. If it's producing more benefit than cost, you're efficient.
I see. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think these are the kinds of models we would use to make these kinds of decisions, but it's not necessarily that easy to figure out what numbers to plug into the variables and stuff
There's
like
some
that.
things that are clear, like for example, someone mentioned public goods, and then there's also public good problems, like pollution, if it's a diffuse cost with an individual incentive to contribute to the cost, you're not going to have the free market handling that very well. So there's some theory that can guide us in some cases really well, but I also agree that there's these edge cases where it's hard to know.
Nowadays, governments should make more regulations for policies for environment. I think that we should be more capitalist, but since it is based on consumption, it ruins the environment.
Ooh. Oh, this is a good segue into our next quote from the article. So they're talking about capitalism. It's all based on the principle of supply and demand, and in capitalism, consumption is king. So what do we think about that? I mean, I feel like consumption is what should be king. It should be about what people can get out of the economy.
Right.
The economy exists for the benefit of the people. But certainly there's side effects to and externalities to economic activity that we want to mitigate, such as pollution and that kind of thing.
The interesting thing, I would totally agree with that. In capitalism, consumption is king to an extent.
Mm-hmm.
Capitalism is also very self-defeating in the sense that it can reduce overall consumption. Like one of the points of having something like UBI is because people who don't make a certain amount of money will not spend it because they don't have it, and it will eventually drive down consumption. As long as there's money flowing more in one direction than another, you get sort of, if you imagine it as like a water system, you get these reservoirs of money in the economy.
Right.
And a healthy economy is typically measured by more flow than it is actual size.
Yeah,
So-
I totally agree.
So the,
Private companies, they based on consumption.
Sorry, I don't think I heard that.
I mean, the private sector, they want to sell more and more. So
Yeah.
There-
their
so-
priority is this.
Right, but
So-
he's saying if people don't have the money to buy it, then even if they want to sell it, there won't be a customer there. I think that's what
Basically, what it comes down to is like you can almost think of poverty as like a negative externality in economic terms. Any individual company has an incentive for the populace writ large to be wealthy because a wealthy populace will buy their product. I agree with you, but also they would much rather other people contribute to the
Right.
populace
It's a
being
public
wealthy than they do it
So-
because them doing it costs them
So-
out of their own
I
pocket.
I also think that socialism also tends to make lots of wasting resources.
Right, like we
It
heard some
also makes
examples of
same
that,
thing,
yeah.
actually.
So my question for Jared is, do you feel that the consumers having insufficient incomes to buy all the stuff, do you feel like that's a defect of capitalism, or do you feel that it's more because we don't have a basic income or something like that?
I would point to it as a defect of capitalism. I think the way I typically think of capitalism anyway is in terms of capital in like the classical sense, capital meaning investment, right? The capital for a venture is the money you put down to begin that business venture.
Are you also thinking about like productive, like durable productive resources like equipment and stuff like that as capital, or are you thinking mostly as money?
Well, money, but money used to buy that.
Right.
So yes, kind of. But when I think of capitalism, capitalism to me is a system in which there are investors and business owners who control the means of production, as opposed to socialism, where it would be in the hands of workers.
Right.
If it's business owners who control the means of production, it's at some point in their incentive to get more money for themselves.
Sure.
That's not any sort of moral judgment on them. That's just how incentives work. And because they have power, because they own the means of production, that is a form of economic power in their hands, they will tend to be able to get more money for themselves. And the more money they get, the more they will be able to invest and get more productive resources, which means more power, which means more money. I consider this, in physics we have this notion of static versus a dynamic equilibrium, where a static equilibrium is a system that will reset itself if perturbed, and a dynamic equilibrium will just fall to pieces if perturbed. I consider capitalism a dynamic equilibrium where the unbalance in capitalism will only unbalance itself further to the point where you get this effect.
I see. Would we get this effect even of the basic income?
I think you
Consumer spending
I think
keeps
you would
getting
I think
replenished.
you would have somewhat of a ceiling on it. That would be the point of universal basic income. You could deprive people of wealth, but only up to a point, because there is a ceiling to the poverty you can create because you're just giving people a flat amount of money,
So
right?
one thing about how Alex thinks about basic income, just before we go to Richard, like that might affect how you think about it, is that he would set the basic income as high as possible without seeing inflation, rather than as a fixed amount. So that might affect how you
Right.
work it
It
through,
would
but it might
be-
affect how you think about the balance.
It would be determined algorithmically by the highest amount of consumer spending that the economy can productively respond to, rather than as like some basic minimum standard of living. Like that's how I think about basic
Which is
income.
atypical, so I thought you might not have
Right.
that in mind.
That's-
Yeah.
I talk about it as being a calibrated basic income rather than a subsistence basic income, because it's calibrated to the productive capacity of the economy.
That's interesting. I don't think that affects my statement, but that's interesting to know.
Yeah. And then another question we might ask is, to what extent do we care about who controls the means of production, and should we be caring about that, or should we be caring more about how much access people have to the product itself? We're going to go to Richard first.
Actually, for decades, companies haven't been really investing in themselves. Like, R&D has been down much lower than was like 30 years ago. And like, for instance, like pharmaceuticals, they don't really produce research much of anything anymore. They just like iterate on what they already produced. Like, some form of drug is like, we're going to make it so it's what it transforms into in your stomach or something. And so they've just been doing like stock buybacks and things like that. So How would you interpret stock buybacks and whatnot?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
I think he would say it's still capitalist, that you're, I think.
It's
I think
privately
kind of looking at the
controlled,
production
yeah.
broadly.
It's a straw man argument that you make because
That I make?
in the him
Jared.
because in the history of mankind, you know, there's never been a process
So-
until we go back to like.
I'm going to interrupt you again, Chris, because I think to some extent you're talking past each other a little bit, because Jared is talking more about theory, and I think you're talking more about like how things are being put into practice, which Jared would argue is probably
Okay,
been
but let me
imperfect.
make one point. Theory is only good if you have any evidence in the past that have supported. So you had to give out some significant example where the worker have actually controlled
Well, so
production.
in physics, when we talk about evidence, we mean like a repeatable experiment. I'm unaware of the existence of a repeatable experiment in economics. Give me a lab large enough
Right,
to
especially
store an
at the macro
economy, and I'll get
level,
back to you on that.
Yeah.
No, it's not repeal.
Um,
It's something that's it's something that, you know, the communism when they first started in Russia and China, they wanted to happen,
So,
but they have and they have all the power, but they turn out to be something very different. And actually,
Yeah.
they tried it in about 10 different other countries. They all turn out to be. None of them actually, based on the experience of the prior country, you know, came up to the solution. So I would just say that property control, you know, to say, because when you say, so the distinction here is that you say, when you say the resource is controlled by the workers, how would you define the worker? Do you define the worker by the particular 100 worker working that factory, or do you define the worker to be the entire population? Because in a what I call a socialism control understanding, actually it's the entire population. That's the definition. So it's once you get back to, it never gets to like say, oh, I'm making a widget, so I'm controlling the resource of this widget. That's never been the intent of any doctrines that I know of.
So
That's all I'm saying.
Yeah,
Because when
yeah.
you talk about the theory, I want to correct that particular theory because that theory is not based on any type of socialism that I'm aware of.
I mean, to kind of bring the two threads together a little bit, I think there is this issue that we've seen come up time and time again throughout history, where when people try to apply socialism or communism to real-world situations, it ends up not being like the ideal that the people wanted to have in place in terms of what they were thinking about as communism, and that could be. And I think it's very likely that this is a flaw in the theory.
well, let's be careful
yeah.
going about names of things too. Like, people often will cite to me North Korea as an example of socialism because they call themselves socialist.
Right.
North Korea
So-
also called themselves a democratic republic. I don't think anyone here would call them a democracy.
Right, and the Nazis called themselves socialists too. So I just invoked
But the Nazis
good
were
one's law.
socialists.
So now it's time to move on to the next question.
Yeah.
The Nazis were
We'll go to Pablo and then we'll move on to the next
Yeah,
question.
one thing I think there's a lot of misinterpretation of Marxism, or maybe differences, and
Yeah.
I think one particular example would be when Mao Zedong and his Soviet counterpart, I guess Nikita
Khrushchev.
Khrushchev, I think they had a falling apart based on their interpretation of Marxism.
Yeah.
I think that was a down moment for the Soviet Soviet relationship.
Well, no. Also, the Soviet Union asked for about like equivalent of $10 billion, and Mao says no.
What?
Well, at the time, Soviet Union was supplying a lot of heavy military equipment and factory equipment to China, right? And they were charging a certain amount, not in pure money, but also in goods and labors and stuff in return, right? And at a certain point, Mao doesn't seem, this is where capitalism come into play between two communist countries. He said, this is not a good deal for me. I no longer want to pay you. I no longer want to pay you the same amount of good that, like I was going to before. And Khrushchev says, okay, screw you. You can build your own, heavy equipment and military equipment. I'm going to stop shipping to you. I'm going to ship them to Cuba instead. And that's where it was. So it was a
Sure, he had
purely
just as
economic.
big of
It
a
was a
market
purely
in
economic
Cuba.
decision.
I saw it a little bit differently.
We're gonna move on to the next quote though, and this will be the last one for tonight. So In a capitalist country, the focus is on profits over anything else. In a socialist country, the public is seen to be more important, and social welfare is a major priority. So I kind of want to, with that quote, I want to go around and get everybody's thoughts about that particular quote.
Is this our last chance to talk?
This is your last chance to talk.
Alright, I might add on something else.
You can add on something else. Yeah.
Yeah, so I don't find this quote super helpful. I think I would go back to what we were saying in the beginning, which is I think that sort of sincere proponents of these different systems all believe that
Well,
they're for the...
Let me ask another question on top of this quote,
Yeah.
which is, what is the difference between profits and social welfare?
Right, well, that's kind of where I was going, which is
Yeah.
I think that people who see the value of the free market for at least some things would say that the beautiful thing is that it produces a lot of wealth, which can then be for the benefit of social welfare, pretty dramatically. And I think that I agree with that, but I think also there's a need to align, as we talked about, the profit motive with the social welfare through various kinds of things. Let's see what else to say. Maybe more. Yeah, I don't know if the public is seen to be more important in one or the other. I would say probably generally not, but I have been noticing like some people seem to pick up on certain threads about, for example, whether the individual needs to earn the money, which is actually sort of true to both in a certain sense. But yeah, I don't know, not making a lot of sense. I wanted to raise one other question just in terms of how both theories seem to see things, which is if we were to imagine a society that didn't need most people's labor to run efficiently, how would we think of that in terms of these two theories? Because it just seems like over and over again they're both really predicated on the worker, as you said before.
Yeah, great
and
question.
so they don't offer a lot of space for that.
I don't find the quote very accurate about concerning capitalism. I would go to the very beginning of the debate. I think you mentioned some things about what's her name?
Mine?
Yeah,
Dimash?
about socialism. When you said that socialism does not offer any individualism, and I find that very true, and I find that as something that is bad for the welfare of a society if there's no individualism, because obviously we're all unique as people, so I think that uniqueness can be better represented in a capitalist state than a socialist state. But overall, yeah, I find that quote is not very representative.
I think capitalism and socialism defined as a way of rationing needs, like managing needs and wants would be, better to who decides who gets what. Is it market plan economy or like central plan economy? I think if we do in that sense, I think we might, get to a better understanding of both.
Chris?
This article was written in 2018, right?
Yeah.
I think this person needs to actually go visit China and to a lesser extent India now versus what they learned in the books like say 20 years ago or 30 years ago. Because I would say right now China, based on pure capitalist definition, is probably more capitalistic than the United States right now. Because people that doesn't have health insurance, people doesn't have retirement fund, and they have no social saving net.
They just don't call themselves capitalists.
Yeah, no.
I don't
And
know why that is.
everything's profit.
Yeah.
Everything's profit driven. The whole, and people are extremely profit conscious, much more than here. And so the definition that Kim has, well intended, is very simplistic. In terms of that statement, in terms of what defines capitalism and what defines socialism. I think really at the end of the day, it's based on what you said also, this is really a mixed bag right now. And say, what is it now?
Sure. All right. Super.
I will keep.
Okay. Robert?
Okay, yeah. So I think probably, like you said, it's kind of an oversimplistic view of capitalism. Not sure it's entirely accurate. I think probably the distinction in this quote is that capitalism focuses maybe on self-interest or responding to yourself first, and socialism is a greater good. But I think capitalism is probably the more effective route in that sense that a rising tide lifts all boats, per se. It's just mine.
Okay. Elizabeth?
The definition of capitalism as like the focusing on profits over everything else feels really accurate to me, and because it gets it sort of calls back to some of what I was thinking earlier when we were talking about like, oh, there's never been a successful socialist country. I was wondering like, okay, like how would we define a successful capitalist country? Like there's the no true Scotsman argument of like, well, there's never been a totally free market, and so we've never had a truly capitalist country. But then there's also the question of like, how do we define like a successful whatever? And so like a lot of people will point to all the poverty in capitalist countries and be like, well, capitalism is clearly failing these people, and so we can say, oh, it's succeeding as a capitalist economy because there's lots and lots of profits. It's doing the thing it's supposed to as a capitalist economy. But if we want successful countries and like we want well-being for people, like how would we define that? And like, are the capitalist countries actually doing that in a way that we can feel good about, given all of the poverty and all the other terrible things that happen? Like, I'm not saying like, oh, it's better or worse than like so-called socialist countries, but just in and of itself.
Yeah. Katie. Richard.
Let's take a specific industry like healthcare, like I was talking about before. Well, Alex said it was like a catastrophic thing, where if you plan it centrally, and people benefit more from that, and they don't, well, want to pay into something that might never happen to them. But if it's a capitalist economy, like there's pre-existing health conditions where they want to exclude someone, or they, because of that, or they have to have a high deductible and spend up to $5,000 in a year, and or else you don't get anything from it, or all these specific things. And so the people get excluded from something they need desperately, and so they have to go into bankruptcy, or if they spend years paying off the $30,000 or whatever for spending a week in the hospital. Or
Yeah. Dimash?
After the answers, I'm a bit confused. What was the question?
So the question is, what do you think about this quote? And then also on top of that, what is the difference between profits and social welfare?
Well, like profits. According to the quote, I think it infers like that profits of the individual, like I'm getting profit and I'm good with it. I don't care whether the masses, like all other people, my neighbors or other people like who live in this very town with me, get profit or not. Like I'm getting profit, I'm good. Well, socialism and social welfare is about collectivism. Like we profit as a community. Like everybody gets something for him. Well, that is the difference. And about socialism and capitalism, like at all, capitalism is good in producing goods because it knows how to efficiently produce, when and in the scale, etc. Like as we understood tonight. But socialism is better in distributing these goods. Yeah. So that is the best answer for this, I think, is some mixture of capitalism and socialism. Like capitalism and socialism, strict capitalism and strict socialism, and communism is like a 20th century thing, maybe even 19th century thing. Today we must like think more about the most efficient mixture of both, without like fanatism.
Yeah. Cool. George.
A few points. Point number one, forget about communism. It never existed. And it's questionable if it can exist. Because the principle of communism is from everybody by his or her capacities, and to everybody by his or her needs. So I can go and grab because I need it. And that's communism, and economically it's kind of it's oxymoron, if you want. It doesn't, number one. Number two, there is no concept of profit under socialism, because everything is planned, centralized. So it's not about profits at all. Somebody decides what kind of clothes I'm going to wear, what kind of color, what kind of tie, what kind of socks. And they plan it and then produce it. The factory doesn't care about profits. The factory doesn't care if what they make will be sold for profit or without profit. They only care about to produce as much stuff as they were ordered to produce or more. And this starts eating up the whole system. Okay, now capitalism. I don't know, maybe I was indoctrinated when I was young like you, because I believe, yes, it is about profits. But there is a big danger, and since you refer to some stuff in physics, I would permit myself to refer to some stuff in mathematics. There is the mathematical theory of control. And in that theory, it's a known thing, the contradiction, we call it, referring to that Russian novel, the problem of fathers and sons. And what it means is you have a system which consists of relatively independent parts, and every system contemporary is like that. So if you optimize efficiency of each particular, every particular part, it doesn't necessarily mean that it will bring you to the optimization of the system as a whole. So there is a contradiction. You want to optimize the system is one thing. You want to optimize your particular department, it's a totally different thing. And by the way, many of those things are discussed in John Kenneth Galbraith's The New Industrial Society, which I strongly recommend to read after you have read Karl Marx, because he explains how it develops further. Okay? And yes, that's true that theoretically socialism is concerned more about like distribution. But it would be incorrect to say that when you say that socialism is concerned about the public, it shouldn't be. The public is not a collection of you, me, and everything. No, they view it as some entity which has no elements. They don't care about each particular member of that public. In general, they know this public, the population of the Soviet Union, they need like, I don't know, 150 million tons of wheat. Fine, these days they make bread not of the brands of wheat which are developed for making bread. They use wheat which normally was supposed to be fed to cattle. It still will make bread of lower quality, less protein. Well, gluten these days in this country is a no-no, but I was taught that gluten is the most valuable part. So, you know, but anyway, the protein, whatever. So this is how they plan. They say, well, 150 million tons, that's it, period. What kind of, it's the second question. They don't care about each particular individual. You want a mini skirt or you want a maxi skirt, we don't give a damn. We have planned and this is what we make, okay? So, but again, read Galbraith because he shows that element of socialism necessarily get implemented in the capitalism, so contemporary capitalism society. Because when Karl Marx developed his problem, capitalists, they just simply ate more. You know?
All right.
They consumed more, just on the everyday basis. Today, because of the development of technology, the agriculture, like apparently this country can feed the whole population at a certain level.
Can you wrap it up?
Yeah, but so the point is that you have to take into account development of technology, which contributes to everything, and don't be concerned too much about financial investments, because financial investments make absolutely no sense when there is working, productive economy which produces something. Otherwise, money per se have no meaning. And to finish, I already recommended once, read Robert Louis Stevenson, Treasure Island. In the last chapters, provides a very clear example why it is necessary
You
to have.
can't eat gold. All right, so let's move on to Jared.
I seem to have been imbued by a completely undemocratic process with the last word here.
Well, I'm actually going to get the last word.
Even more undemocratic.
Socialism.
The question was what we thought of the difference between profit and social value.
Yeah, profit and social welfare, and what you think about this quote.
Well, so profit, at least according to like the labor model of value, profit is like you have a worker who does something, who creates value by doing labor of some kind, and some percentage of that is overhead that feeds this system that allows him to do that labor, and some of that is the stuff that worker is given, which could be the entire product of his labor if he's like a person doing something for himself, or typically we think of it in terms of wages. It's some percentage, and then profit is kind of what's left over past that, which from this standpoint is very much the enemy of a socialist system. It's what a socialist under this framework wants is to remove that element of the worker's labor which isn't going to the worker. If that's what we call profit, then I would say the difference between that and social welfare is like night and day. They're unrelated. They're antitheses almost.
Okay. Yeah, so I think it's tricky because, different people in different circles are going to define the term profit differently. Like most economists would say that profit is just an increase in utility or something like that. So there's profit of the individual, that's the individual is better off. Then there might be a profit of a company, that means the company is better off based on something that happened, that kind of thing. So according to that definition of profit, social welfare just means, an increase in social welfare just means everybody profits. So that's certainly one way to think about it. But I also think that companies' profits kind of, the incentive to earn profit kind of drives the productive process in a market economy. And obviously we want things to be produced for people. So I think it's true that a capitalist economy is very profit oriented, and to the extent that the markets can be efficient in determining what people want based on what they're willing to pay for, a basic income, or ensuring that consumers have spending money at all times or have an optimal level of spending money, kind of makes that more efficient and more optimal. So I guess that's it. This was a great discussion, everybody. Thank you all for coming out. Everyone had great stuff to say. My mom said some things. She said social welfare can't really be separated from money. What social welfare can we have without being able to pay for it? She's not sure about the quote. So I think that's right. I think there are things that money can't buy. Obviously, that's the cliche. But there are things that people need that you can buy with money. That's the way to get it. And I think that's really important too. So thanks everybody. Next week we're talking about economic growth.
Yeah, we're gonna blast ourselves.
Everyone clap for yourselves.
What are we going to do? Are we going to do like the Jacobin article at some other point?